Seeing where the Blades are today under Chris Wilder warms my heart, and it got me thinking back to their tragic and very controversial relegation at the end of the 06-07 season, and the court battles that ensued between Sheffield United and West Ham with Javier Mascherano and, most importantly, Carlos Tevez at the heart of it. Let's take a look at that situation, including how these South American stars ended up at the struggling London club, the illegalities of their moves, how it affected the relegation race, and the fallout from it. By the way, I'm Adrian, and if you find yourself enjoying this video from us here at Rabona TV, us being me, myself, and I, then consider subscribing to help the channel out. Alright, let's go back to the 2006 World Cup in Germany. If you followed Argentinian football in the early 2000s, then you would have been excited to see a 22-year-old Carlos Tevez had made the Argentina World Cup squad for the 2006 World Cup in Germany. Some backstory: after catching the attention of South American football and then the world as a talented Boca Juniors boy through and through, he somewhat surprisingly, though perhaps quite logically, made the move from Boca to Corinthians in 2005. A good natural step that modern young talents could take note of, actually. This was the most expensive South American football transfer at the time, and Tevez thrived in Brazil during the 2005 Campeonato, and part of the 2006 season as well. His performances were definitely worthy of making that World Cup squad. Given that Argentina had the likes of Javier Saviola and Hernan Crespo for striking options, Tevez wasn't necessarily a shoo-in starter right away for Argentina. However, after scoring in a 6-0 rout of Serbia and Montenegro, Tevez earned starts against the Netherlands and later in Argentina's shootout loss against the hosts, Germany. All the while, his Argentinian teammate, Javier Mascherano, who at the time also played for Corinthians, was establishing himself as one of football's top up-and-coming talents as well, mostly operating at this time as a defensive midfielder. Mascherano had an even bigger role for Argentina at the 2006 World Cup actually, as he started in every single match and played every single minute. So, you can see how it was very, very surprising when on August 31st, 2006, West Ham announced the double signings of Mascherano and Tevez from Corinthians. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of these transfers and how they were illegal later in the video. Now, the main component to West Ham's survival was of course Carlos Tevez. But Tevez didn't even score for West Ham until the final 10 matches of the season, in which he netted 7 times. In West Ham's conquest to survive the Premier League, Tevez scored an important goal in a 2-1 win over Blackburn Rovers, scoring the 71st minute equalizer in a 4-minute comeback, capped off by a Bobby Zamora winner. Then, in the penultimate match of the season against Bolton Wanderers, a first-half masterclass and a brace from Tevez contributed to a 3-0 lead by halftime, in what was a 3-1 win. This victory gave West Ham a chance at survival as they went away to Old Trafford for the final match of the season. If they could get a victory there somehow, they would survive. Sheffield United, on the other hand, were in 16th going into the final match day and had to play fellow relegation candidates Wigan, who were 3 points behind them in the standings. A relegation 6-pointer on the final match day. You love to see it, if you're a neutral. The visitors, Wigan, went ahead just 14 minutes in, but the Blades tied it up in the 38th minute. Wigan was awarded a penalty in first half injury time, and former Sheffield United player David Unsworth converted to put Wigan ahead 2-1. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, where United were already crowned champions and fielded a weakened side, another first half injury time goal, this time for West Ham, was scored by none other than Carlos Tevez. This goal meant that Carlos Tevez had played a part in 55% of West Ham's goals in their final 5 matches of the season. He'd certainly left his mark. West Ham and United traded chances back and forth as the champions looked to get back into the match by bringing on Scholes, Giggs, and Ronaldo, while in Sheffield, Wigan's McCulloch was sent off with 16 minutes remaining. Sheffield needed a goal in order to survive and condemn Wigan to the championship. But with Man United looking out of sorts and Sheffield unable to score, Tevez's strike was the difference maker, and it was Sheffield who went down to the championship alongside Charlton and Watford. No doubt, this had Sheffield thinking of every post they hit, every near opportunity, and of course, the illegalities of Tevez playing a part in West Ham's great escape, given that Mascherano had transferred to Liverpool in January of 2007. That transfer, funnily enough, was where the problems began for West Ham. So, as stated earlier, it came as a shock to pretty much everyone when Tevez and Mascherano were holding up West Ham kits on deadline day of the 2006 summer transfer window. In rushing to get the deal over the line, West Ham executives failed to realize that both Mascherano and Tevez were partially owned by third parties. Media later speculated that perhaps bigger clubs hadn't signed these Argentina internationals for this reason alone. The fact that it was illegal to. Tevez and Mascherano's rights were partially owned by Media Sports Investment, or MSI, which was headed up by Kia Joorabchian. Now, Joorabchian was also part of a group of investors that during that same summer of 2006 failed in an attempt to take over West Ham. So Joorabchian's fingerprints were all over the shadier parts of the club at the time. What a scummy man. There you go. A little more Arctic Monkeys for you, a little more Sheffield for you. So months go by and Tevez doesn't have much of an impact for most of the season, as you'll remember from earlier in the video, while Javier Mascherano certainly impressed in the midfield and was pursued by Benitez's Liverpool. Also, in November, West Ham were taken over by an Iceland consortium that was headed by Egert Magnusson. In Liverpool's pursuit of Mascherano, they realized that something was a little fishy about the ownership of the player, and they informed West Ham of the third-party involvement in his contract. Magnusson sent the contracts of Tevez and Mascherano to the Premier League head office, and the wrongdoing of the former ownership of West Ham was confirmed by the Premier League. So, let's jump ahead 3 months. The Premier League fined West Ham £5.5 million on April 27, 2007, which was a record fine, but Tevez could still play. Other teams called for a point deduction instead of a fine, but the Premier League refused, siding with West Ham in their belief that matters of relegation should be settled on the pitch, as a point deduction would surely condemn them to the championship. The Hammers were found guilty of acting improperly and withholding vital documentation over 2 players' ownership, Tevez and Mascherano, given that when previously asked about the players, they denied any third-party ownership or wrongdoing. In fact, in the ruling, it was stated that West Ham's former chief executive Paul Aldridge told Premier League chief executive Richard Scudamore a, quote, direct lie in regards to how Tevez and Mascherano were owned by offshore companies. The violations that West Ham were guilty of were therefore twofold. The first violation, Rule B13, which states that all Premier League clubs must act in good faith, aka not lie about things such as this when they are questioned, like Aldridge withholding information regarding the illegal contracts. As the ruling panel put it, they were charged for their, quote, dishonesty and deceit. The other rule that they broke was Rule U18, which relates to third-party ownership of players. To sum up Rule 18, The Guardian's David Heitner wrote, "The league does not want anyone outside of a club to be able to materially influence their policies, not only in terms of selection, but potentially when and where a player could transfer to." West Ham would have received a points deduction if they hadn't pleaded guilty and admitted the wrongdoing. Because of this, the Premier League was easier on them. Yes, they still fined them £5.5 million, which, as I said, was a record fine, but that's nothing in comparison to what West Ham would have lost out on in television rights payments if they had gone down to the championship. By the club's own estimates, they would have lost about £20 million if they were relegated, so you can see why they would take their chances with the £5.5 million fine and the potential of staying in the top flight. Obviously, it paid off in the end as they stayed up at the expense of others, namely Sheffield. So, when the verdict was announced on April 27, 2007, all the teams that were in direct competition with West Ham in the fight against relegation were clearly incensed. Fulham, Wigan, and Sheffield United called for the Premier League to deduct points from West Ham, but the league refused. At the minimum, these teams wanted Carlos Tevez to be ineligible to play, to rip up his contract. So, following the end of the season, Sheffield United appealed their relegation, but they lost that appeal despite a separate arbitration panel stating that they, quote, would in all probability have reached a different conclusion and deducted points from West Ham. A year after that, in 2008, Sheffield again appealed and, as John Ashdown wrote for The Guardian, an independent FA tribunal found in their favour, with the chair, Lord Griffiths, judging that we have no doubt that West Ham would have secured at least 3 fewer points over the 2006-07 season if Carlos Tevez had not been playing for the club. Oof, ouch. Hearing that a year later must have been infuriating to hear for Sheffield United, but also incredible, as it really gave momentum to Sheffield in getting something out of all of this. So with over a year passing since they were relegated, Sheffield United now sought out compensation for the damages they received due to said relegation. Initially, it was said that they wanted up to £45 million, but in a story on The Telegraph from September 2008, Jeremy Wilson wrote that Sheffield United claimed they lost out on nearly £22 million in television and merchandising rights, as well as bonus payments. The rest of the claim for their damages is based on ticket sales, sponsorship deals, club merchandising, and a loss of £4 million for the sale of Phil Jagielka to Everton due to a clause in the player's contract. Before the case could reach the Court of Arbitration for Sport, however, Sheffield United and West Ham were able to agree upon an out-of-court settlement, which would see West Ham pay Sheffield United £5 million per year for 4 years, totaling to £20 million. Far from the $45 million that the Blades had previously sought out in missed ticket sales, sponsorship opportunities, and television revenues, but it did bring a conclusion to the mess that West Ham had made for them. Following that relegation, Sheffield United's struggles continued, getting relegated to League One in 2011, where they would stay for 6 years. Chris Wilder got them promoted back to the Championship during the 2016-17 season, and then back into the Premier League 2 years later. And as things stand in early February, they're not just back, but thriving, as Wilder has Sheffield not fighting relegation again, but fighting for a European place alongside Manchester United, Tottenham, Wolves, Everton, and Arsenal. But before this, you had guys like Nick Montgomery from the 06-07 team saying, "I had dreamed of playing in the Premier League all my life, and after one season, it was snatched away. People say justice will be done at last if we go up, but I don't think justice will ever be done." For him, and many other Blades from that era, they never did get the chance to play in the Premier League again. Thankfully for the fans, however, they've fallen on much, much better times. And so that is how Tevez, thanks to his ownership and the compliance of West Ham, played a part in Sheffield's relegation back in 2007. And now we're seeing West Ham struggle once again as things stand in February 2020. So if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you hit subscribe in order to get more videos like it from Rabona TV. But other than that, thanks for stopping by. I love ya, and take care.